Kathy Barnette is the National Grassroots Director for Vivek Ramaswamy, who is, of course, a up-and-coming presidential candidate. He announced that he's running for president. He joins a semi-crowded field of former President Donald Trump, also former South Carolina governor and former United Nations ambassador Nikki Haley, who's also running for the presidency. We also, as of just last week, a week ago from today, South Carolina Senator Tim Scott announced that he was also running. The former Arkansas governor, Asa Hutchinson, is in the race. Lots of candidates, but Vivek Ramaswamy wants to overcome some of those candidates and ultimately secure the GOP nomination to be the next president of the United States. Kathy Barnette, the National Grassroots Director, thanks for making the time.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me.
So I suppose I want to begin here with a policy that when I heard about, I read into it a little bit more. I read some articles. I saw what some other folks were saying, and I guess I'm just curious to get your take on it. Mr. Ramaswamy has proposed raising the voting age in the U.S. to the age of 25, with some specific exceptions. You would have to serve in the military, perhaps, or some sort of first responder or a civics test. So just before we get started, do you agree with that policy?
Absolutely. Listen, voting is a privilege, and I cannot think of a better way to overcome some of the challenges we're contending with in our culture than to tie voting, that privilege, with civic duty, with those types of preconditions, right? As you've already delineated some of them, serving in the military for at least 6 months, or participating in some form of first responder, whether law enforcement or firefighters or ambulance or whatever the case may be, or simply taking a test, the same test that we ask those who want to become citizens to take in this country. So I wholeheartedly support the civic duty voting amendment that Vivek is proposing to put before our Congress. I can't think of anything better. I mean, especially when you consider what it is, the challenges that we're facing in our country right now. One of the latest polls that I saw showed that Gen Z, your generation, I believe, that only 16% of them in that particular poll said they are proud to be an American. Our nation is in survival mode right now. And then in addition to that, a 25% deficit in the enrollment in military among, once again, your generation primarily. And so I think this is a wonderful idea, a bold idea, but something that is needed to combat some of the issues that we're facing in our culture.
And I mean, I have to ask, a lot of countries are thinking about lowering their voting age. This comes at a time with Mr. Ramaswamy's proposal when a lot of the other campaigns are thinking, okay, how can we attract young voters to our campaign? Just with, observation and through looking at some of these policies, are you not concerned that that will have the opposite effect, and that, young Republican primary voters will, not be as enthused to vote for someone like Mr. Ramaswamy if they are looking at taking, the ability to vote away for someone under the age of 25?
As I said before, as I tried to delineate a few moments ago, we have some very real issues in our nation, and we need to learn the art of looking beyond each individual election cycle and begin to think down the road about the survival of our nation. When we have over 3/4 of your generation, the Gen Z generation, saying that they're not proud to be an American, or when you have such a huge deficit in those in your generation who are wanting to go and serve this country, again, our nation is on the precipice of not surviving. What do you do in order to instill that kind of civic excitement about our country? This is a constitutional republic. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And the fact that we just sit back and kick our feet up and think that we're on cruise control as a country, we have to do something, begin to think outside the box of helping, especially your generation, but even beyond your generation, but specifically your generation, understand that this is a privilege, this nation, all the things that you've been able to enjoy, all the things I've been able to enjoy, that those things come at a cost. And one of those costs is for us to be civic minded, to be engaged, and to do our part to put our hands to the plow. And again, I think the requirements, some of the preconditions Vivek has outlined are very minimum preconditions. The bar isn't being raised to such an extent that people cannot overcome it. Either you wait until you're 25 years old to enjoy the privilege of voting, or between 18 and 25, you serve a minimum of 6 months in the military, first responder, or you simply take the same test that we ask those who are coming to our country to take. Again, very low expectations, but something that will, whether the amendment passes or not, I think it is so beneficial to think about the conversation between now and then, the conversation that the nation will have between now and that particular amendment becoming law.
And I mean, I do want to move on to some other topics as well, but just sticking with this topic for a few more moments here. I mean, a lot of people, argue that the voting age should be lowered as opposed to raised. A lot of people often give the argument that, younger people, 16 and over in many cases are contributing to society. They're, paying taxes just as much as someone, who is 18 years of age or over that would. How can someone get excited about the process of elections, about civics in the United States, if they don't have the ability to vote? And then furthermore to that, I mean, there have been some studies that have been done talking about how if you lower the voting age, for example, or even just keep it the same as what it is, that it perhaps will be more likely to create those habits with young people for the remainder of their adult life. Are you concerned, though, that perhaps with this policy that could actually have the opposite effect?
No, I'm not. Again, I think we have bigger fish to fry. And one of those bigger fish is the fact that our nation is not doing very well. And how do we instill this sort of civic responsibility, this sort that this is, not just someone else's country, but that is our country, and that we need to be engaged and we need to be involved and we need to be excited. And again, when you have over 80% of your generation saying they're not sure if they're proud to be an American, when my generation begins to move on and we hand this country over to you and to your generation, if you have 80% of your generation saying, I don't know if I like this country or not. I think this country is evil, systemically racist. I mean, like, those are really bad, a bad mindset to have. And we see this more and more in our culture. And again, I'm just citing one particular poll, but I've seen a number of them that will cause the adults in the room to look around and say, what can we do to excite and to instill this civic mindedness within the next generation, who's going to have the wonderful privilege of taking the greatest nation in the world and extending it beyond. So I don't think it's bold. In fact, I think some of the things that we're contending with or what we're watching the left do on their side, that's bold.
And I mean, you definitely are making some fair points, but I mean, you're talking about Generation Z, my generation. I guess my point that I'm kind of curious about here is that I don't necessarily think that it's just Generation Z who isn't as civically engaged to make a decision as to who they should vote for in an election. I mean, you cited the one poll of 16%. But, when you're talking with different people on a day-to-day basis, in preparation for this interview, I talked with some different people, and there's a lot of adults in the room oftentimes too, who it seems aren't as civically engaged as they should be either. So really, how are you going to target those people if you're only saying if you're under, the age of 25, when in reality, in a lot of cases, again, adults are not super, civically engaged a lot more than, say, children.
Yeah, listen, I think that is very fair and very apropos, very fitting, a very fitting observation that you make. You're right. It's not just a Gen Z, but in this one regard, this is one particular amendment to address the lack of civic mindedness within your particular generation. So now let's move beyond that, because the umbrella under which I guess we could say that Vivek Ramaswamy's presidential campaign is running under is the one of reviving this sense of American identity that doesn't just impact your generation, but impacts all generations within our country. Because I believe we've lost our sense of who we are as a nation. I think if you ask the question, what does it mean to be an American? Most people, not just relegated to your generation, but most people across the spectrum will give you a deer in the headlights look, unsure of what does it mean to be an American. And I believe it's because we don't know who we are as a country that we have allowed ourselves to become susceptible to the wolves in sheep clothing who would try to sell us a different version of who we are. Wolves in sheep clothing who would tell us to whisper the fact that we believe there is a God, or wolves in sheep clothing who would tell us, as Black Lives Matter once told us on their website, that we need to dismantle the nuclear family. That the nuclear family is one of the issues with this country, right? And so when you don't understand who you are, then you become a little bit more susceptible, more gullible for those who come in with the cult of climatism or a cult of globalism or whatever the cult of transgenderism, whatever that cult may be, that would try to redefine who we are. We become susceptible and gullible in many regards. And as a result, our nation, this is another reason why our nation is in peril. And so again, the civic duty voting amendment is just one of a litany of changes of things that Vivek has proposed in doing, in addition to the civic voting amendment. He's also talked about doing away with shutting down the Department of Education. He's also talked about, especially when you're looking at the Durham reports and looking at what the IRS has been up to, when the rot gets so deep in some of these organizations, to shut them down and build something up. He has a plan for the border and securing our border, using our military to actually secure our border instead of securing the borders of other countries halfway around the world. And so the one that we've been primarily talking about, the civic duty voting amendment, it's just one in a litany of things, but there's going to take a lot of different things that we're going to have to be willing to do and sacrifice as a country. There's many aspects of our nation that is gone. And so we're going to have to do the hard work. We can no longer kick the can down the road and think we have time to come back and figure this thing out. So we're going to have to be a little bold. We're going to have to ask Americans to be ready to make some sacrifices. But I think it's easier to ask people like you and people of my generation to make those sacrifices if we remember what it is we're sacrificing for, and that is our country.
And I know we're short on time, but just before we conclude here, I want to ask you about the actual campaign itself. We've been talking a lot about the voting age, et cetera, but zoning in on what this campaign actually means. You obviously have someone like Donald Trump, who has an incredibly high level of name recognition, really unprecedented. And that's kind of a given that he was in the White House for 4 years and that Americans saw him on their television screens almost every day. There is the argument, though, that many are making that the more candidates in the race allows someone like Donald Trump to be successful in the primary to win the GOP nomination. Are you at all concerned of that? And where do you see someone like Vivek Ramaswamy fitting into this presidential campaign?
Yeah. Well, listen, what is very interesting is that Vivek is actually about where, if not a little bit better, where Donald Trump was in 2015 in the polls today. So he's doing quite well. And let's remember, I mean, I think we've probably been on the campaign trail maybe 12 weeks at the most. And when we first walked out in front of the American people, Vivek was polling at 0. And within 10 to 12 weeks, we're now in third place in one of the national polls I saw, tied with former Vice President Mike Pence. This morning, I woke up to another poll that was just taken in New Hampshire, one of the first in the nation states, and Vivek is actually leading in that poll. And these are some of the more uber conservatives. Excuse me, some of the more uber conservatives. And in that particular poll I woke up to for New Hampshire, Vivek is actually leading in that poll. I mean, really, it comes down to the American people. Have we learned our lesson yet? because I think Democrats have done a really good job in trying to teach us what kind of leadership we want. I think Donald Trump, I mean, I voted for him twice, and we can be very grateful for the work that he's done. But in order to take our country to the next level, in order to not just lead with grievance and vengeance as our agenda, but real ideas that has the ability to pull our country back from the precipice, we're going to have to pivot and do something different. And I believe, hopefully, the American people have learned a very valuable lesson. I believe they have.
Okay, we will leave it there. That's Kathy Barnette, National Grassroots Director for Vivek Ramaswamy. Thanks so much for making the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.